President or Acting President, I'm pleased to rise and make a contribution to this bill. In doing so, I want to start by reiterating the points I made before. The government should not have brought this bill today. This should have been brought to the Parliament earlier if the government wanted an extension. The information behind it, the drafts, should have been shared with MPs on both chambers much earlier than is currently the case. To dump this a week out, and indeed we still don't have a printed second reading copy in the chamber that's been emailed only in the last few minutes, and the final version of the bill has only been emailed in the last few minutes as well, tabled in the chamber. So there is a contempt of the Parliament and a contempt of MPs and, more importantly, the community in the government's response here. I make the very strong point here that this bill is a grab for power by Daniel Andrews and his government. The government has been misusing these public health powers, and I want to begin, though, first by stating that I see the need for these powers. As a former health minister, I understand completely the need to deal with these matters. And indeed, many of the powers in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act are powers that I, as minister, used, where we had infections and problems not on this scale of the pandemic that we're facing now, of course, but there were situations and locations where these needed to be used. So I am not immune to or unforgiving about the need for these powers, and indeed this pandemic is a challenge worldwide, Australia-wide and in Victoria. The question is, has the approach adopted by the government been the best approach, and do they need the powers in the form that they're presented for perpetuity? In effect, they went for 12 months, want another 6 months now as they've wound back the numbers in the bill. But still, that is a very long time. And I want to put on the record at the start that part of the exercise of these extraordinary powers, these massive powers, these unprecedented powers that are used in this under the state of emergency, and the subsequent public health orders that are issued under those provisions, is that the government has not honoured the points that should be honoured in terms of information provision and involvement of the community and proportionality. So many of the decisions have been entirely arbitrary, have not been well based. I've indicated to the chamber before, and indeed as recently as this morning, sought leave to move a documents motion to obtain the briefings provided to the health minister regarding many of the orders that have been made. Those briefings have not been provided either at earlier requests going back to March, or have not been even provided under freedom of information. It is an outrage that the government has kept these briefings secret, and it's my view that the government should be providing proper information to the community and to the Parliament. But what has happened with these health orders is they have done tremendous damage in our community. People have been isolated, older people have suffered, younger people have suffered, schooling has suffered for young people, and businesses have been smashed across our state. And it seems that the government has little concern or little care for the businesses of our state, for those whose livelihoods is associated with the businesses in our state. The failure to deal with sole traders, the failure to support them in any way meaningfully at all, the failure of the government to actually provide the support that's needed across so many segments of our business community. So it's not the fact that powers exist, it's the fact that they've been misused, that the government has been cavalier with the provision of information and has not been open and transparent, and that we firmly believe that where these powers are exercised by government, they need to be roped in, they need to be accountable, they need to be transparent about the use and the reasons for the use, and they need to provide the information that's required by the Victorian community. We will move some amendments, and I'll step through those in detail in a moment to explain to the community and the chamber. I've spoken to many in this chamber about them. I should say that I will circulate those when they come back from the Chief Parliamentary Counsel in their final form. Because of the delay in providing the final bill to the chamber, the Parliamentary Council is now working on a further iteration of those bills. But I will go through the essence of those amendments. I will go through the essence of those amendments in detail with the chamber. I want to note that there are different and divergent medical views that are provided across our community. I understand the public health community has a certain particular set of views, and many of them believe that greater information should have been in the public domain. The public should have been able to see, and many in the public health community, experts who can analyse data, if that data was available, they would actually make a contribution. Many other jurisdictions have provided greater access to data for university academics, for those who have knowledge and experience in these areas, and enabled them thereby to actually provide additional contribution, advice to government beyond the bureaucrats in the department. And I think that that is a very important way of improving our response to this. So the information is not only about transparency for transparency and accountability's sake, it is also about providing a better way through this crisis, an information-rich and informed way through the crisis. And the state government's refusal, and I think this is, Brett Sutton has got to take some responsibility here. Jenny Makakos has got to take some responsibility here. And Andrews has got to take some responsibility here. They have clammed up and shut down the provision of information in this state, and that is a travesty, that is a mistake, that is a cover-up, and it's because they have botched the process with this pandemic. Now, we know the first lockdown happened. It smashed so many businesses. It closed things down. But it is this government that has had the greatest public policy failure in the state's history. The greatest public policy failure in the failure with quarantine, hotel quarantine, the failure with contact tracing, the failure to have in place a proper system so that where an outbreak occurs, as it inevitably did and inevitably will, that there is a proper follow-up, a proper contact tracing process that ensures that the proper experts are in place, that testing happens quickly, and all of the contacts of that case are followed and run to ground to actually make sure that the spread from a particular source is stopped. That is not the case in Victoria at the moment. The contact tracing unit is a shambles. It is incompetent. Brett Sutton has not run it properly, and in truth the resources have not been there to enable this to occur. So I understand that there are steps being taken to improve it. Well, they better happen very quickly, because the economic and social damage done to Victoria because of Jenny Makakos and Daniel Andrews' failure in this area is enormous. Failed hotel quarantine, failed contact tracing, and failed focus on protecting health workers. The outbreaks that have occurred with health workers are nothing short of scandalous. The lack of PPE was identified by Ms Crozier as far back as March and April in this place. And we made the point that that PPE needed to be available. We made the point that the PPE needed to be there for those health workers so that they had every protection. Well, I say we have to have their back, but you can't, as Daniel Andrews, he talks very big about the health workers, but then he didn't provide the PPE that they needed to protect them. What an absolute scandal. What an outrage. Our frontline workers not provided with the support and protections that they needed to make them safe. No wonder they don't want scrutiny. No wonder they won't answer questions. No wonder this cover-up continues with Daniel Andrews and his mates and his crew of mates. No wonder the cover-up continues, because they have so much to hide. So much to hide. The greatest public policy failing in the state's history. He says, I can't answer questions. I can't answer questions. Oh, because there's an inquiry into the quarantine. Well, of course, the quarantine inquiry is only one wedge of this state government's extraordinary failure. It's only one scandalous wedge of this state government's extraordinary failure. Oh, but I can't answer questions because there's an inquiry going on. It's not a judicial inquiry, by the way. It doesn't have the full powers to drag anyone in the land and any document in the land in to get to the bottom of what went wrong, but it is only about quarantine. It's not about the contact tracing failings. It's not about the failure for provision of PPE. It's not about all the failures in the public health unit. No, this is not the failings across the spectrum. This is just a tiny wedge. Oh, but Daniel Andrews says, I can't answer questions because there's an inquiry. Well, former Justice Coate made that very clear, didn't she? She said he can answer questions and he should answer questions. And he still won't answer honestly and directly. And nor will his ministers. We hear them twisting and weaving, deciding to cover up the failings of this government. We need a very tough inquiry to get to the bottom of this. But that's not the story for today. The story for today is, why have they brought this with this extraordinary and savage increase in powers for government? And I think it's important, when you look at the bill, I think it's important to put on record what they're actually suggesting. I'm pleased that the further iteration of this narrows this to the public health matters around COVID-19 and is not a general lengthening as was earlier proposed. But I am concerned about some of the definitional aspects, and I point particularly to Clause 3. Without limiting the definition of serious risk to public health in Section 1 and for the purposes of Division 3 of Part 10, COVID-19 may pose a material risk of substantial inquiry or prejudice to health of human beings, even when the rates of the community transmission of COVID-19 in Victoria is low or there have been no cases of COVID-19 for a period of time. This is a request for a state of emergency and extraordinary powers, government powers, to close businesses, to search, to seize, to do all sorts of draconian things, even when there is no COVID. This is an extraordinary new development, an extraordinary widening of these public health powers, and we will oppose it. We will oppose this clause outright. In Clause 6, the Chief Health Officer may authorise exercise of certain powers. In Section 199 1B of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act 2008, before necessary, insert reasonably. Sounds like a small change. Sounds like a sort of a reasonable change. But it isn't. It actually broadens and deepens his powers on a wide front. No longer do the powers just have to be necessary, they only have to be reasonably necessary, opening the way for an extraordinary series of interventions under those powers, at the moment unchecked, unbalanced, unaccounted for, in the sense that information is not provided in the way it should. We will oppose this extraordinary grab for power that will give the health officials these huge powers and Daniel Andrews extraordinary power into the future. We will oppose them because they're wrong. I have to say that our amendments will deal with some of these issues, but those two clauses we will oppose outright. Our amendments will seek to do a number of things. First of all, we will seek a month-to-month approach so that both chambers of Parliament must meet, both chambers of Parliament must approve any further extensions. And that, excuse me, President, can only be on a month-to-month basis. And that will tie these powers and the use of these powers to the scrutiny and accountability that is required in the Parliament. It will ensure that the government cannot exercise these powers without coming back here and to the other chamber, both chambers, to actually make their case. We've said that they will need to put a statement into the Parliament before this occurs. We've said in these amendments that not only will a statement have to be provided to the Parliament, but members of the Parliament will be able to have briefings We can't get the briefings we require on this, and even when we get the briefings and we ask for information, the information is not provided. I asked way back in March for access to the briefings that the Minister for Health and the Chief Health Officer have been provided. We have still not seen those briefings. They are still covered up. They are still secret. And indeed, in some cases, we're in VCAT looking at these, looking for these briefings because the government will not provide them as they should. So we will seek a very clear way forward with these briefings. We will seek that information is provided, and that will be a requirement in the Act. Further, in the amendments that we've circulated to the crossbench, and we'll seek to circulate the final version when the Parliamentary Council provides them, we will seek to put in place a requirement that subordinate legislation will apply, not with respect to regulatory impact statements, or consultation, but in terms of the ability to disallow some of the health orders. So where a health order is made that bans something like farmers' markets, this chamber or the other chamber will have the capacity to disallow. And that will make a significant check on the powers and the misuse of these powers that is becoming increasingly apparent. There are a number of measures to improve transparency. As this goes forward, the section says that during a state of emergency, the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of any other political party represented in the Parliament or an independent elected member may request that the Premier provide briefings or specified information in relation to the circumstances and the state of emergency and so forth. We think this is a minimum. And it's a sad thing that this has to be put sharply into an Act. It's a sad thing because it should be open and transparent. The Premier must answer as soon as reasonable. And we've also said that the Assembly and the Council President and the Speaker will need to make best endeavours to make sure that the House is sitting at least every month. We need tight control on the use of these powers, and the tight control will come from these two chambers sitting. The tight control will come from the provision of information. We say we're going to limit the power to give directions, and I'm going to quote here. For the avoidance of doubt, a direction must not be given under subsection 201D in relation to the attendance in the parliamentary precincts of a member of the Parliament or any other person engaged in the normal carrying on of business of the Parliament. And there's a note in here about section 19 of the Constitution, and you wouldn't have thought that you need to reinforce this. But I say the Chief Health Officer and health officers should not be directing MPs and blocking their attendance at Parliament. That is in effect what we've seen. That is in effect what we've seen. And that is outrageous because the Parliament has a role to scrutinise the activities of the Executive. And going back to 1689 and the Bill of Rights, it's very clear that our privileges and rights to protect our communities, to protect the public, are at stake if you are able to be directed as a Member of Parliament by a middle-ranking official that you will not attend Parliament because of which part of the state you live in. This is a frightening resurgence of executive powers in a way that we need to resist clearly. We also, in these amendments, make it clear that if directions will need to be laid before Parliament. So when the Chief Health Officer makes a direction, he will within 24 hours have to table it in Parliament. He will also have to table the briefings and advice that he has received. And indeed, he will have to put a statement on the objects of the Act, the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, and the issues of proportionality and whether this is the best way to address the particular issue that he seeks to address. Those issues do not apply now. The health officials are able to make these directions without that scrutiny, without that requirement to put in place a proper arrangement for information. So we will seek all of those points. I want to draw attention too in this process to the information, the legal information that Mr O'Donoghue, my colleague, has obtained from Marcus Clark and Vanessa Plain. It is important information. I will let him explain the first half of it, but I want to draw the Chamber's attention to issues around accountability and proportionality that are raised in this advice. The directives, this advice says, made to date in the administration of the Act already give rise to whether they comply with sections 8 and 9 as to accountability and proportionality, which provide 8. Principle of accountability. Persons who are engaged in the administration of this Act should, as far as is practical, ensure that decisions are transparent, systematic and appropriate. 2. Members of the public should therefore be given A. access to reliable information in appropriate forms to facilitate a good understanding of public health issues, and B. opportunities to participate in policy and program development. These have been honoured in the breach by Daniel Andrews, Jenny Makakos and Brett Sutton. The principle of proportionality. Decisions made and actions taken in the administration of this Act, A. should be proportionate to the public health risks sought to be prevented, minimised or controlled, and B. should not be made or taken in an arbitrary manner. Think of the farmers' markets. Banned at 8:30, unbanned at 9:05 p.m. on the Saturday before the markets. Honestly, those poor farmers coming to Melbourne, trucks loaded, told to turn around, told to turn back. What a circus. How's the accountability in that? Where's the transparency? Where's the honesty in the approach? And we still haven't seen the advice. We still don't know on what information he based this. What a complete and utter circus. He goes, never in our history has a curfew been imposed over the entire state, nor have businesses been forced to shut en masse, nor has there been a limit imposed of 1 hour exercise per person to persons not imprisoned, not even in the world wars and the Spanish flu epidemic of 1919. This legal advice goes on. Further, the Chief Health Officer has brought into question the reliability of statistics concerning the death rate recorded in Victoria. In relation to the manner in which the deaths from COVID-19 are calculated, Professor Sutton conceded that irrespective of whether someone dies with COVID or from COVID-19, they are counted as having died of COVID-19. The publicly declared death rate may therefore be exaggerated and will not provide sufficient reliability to form the basis of making the ongoing declarations under the Act, a relevant factor to the application of the principle of accountability and proportionality. He talks about the Charter of Human Rights, and I note that the Charter of Human Rights has huge weaknesses, as I've said many times, with respect to property, but I'll leave that to my colleague. The points I want to make in the relatively small period of time I have remaining is that this is an abuse of power by this government. It has been secretive and non-accountable. It has not allowed Parliament to sit to scrutinise its activities. It has not provided the information that the community have sought and are entitled to. It's made arbitrary decisions which have deprived people of their liberty without the proper proportionality, without the proper protections in place, without the proper accountability. It's deprived people of their businesses and their jobs, and it's done that without the proper information. And part of that is because they botched the process of contact tracing, they botched the hotel quarantine, they botched the provision of PPE, leaving health workers exposed. That's why we have so many health workers who've got COVID-19, is because Daniel Andrews and Jenny Makakos failed to put in place the proper PPE arrangements. And I say our amendments will make this situation better. They will require greater accountability and transparency. We say month-to-month extensions of this have to be tied to the Parliament, have to be tied to agreement by both houses. We have to put this government and its extreme powers on some kind of control, some kind of close watch. We need to make sure that the abuse of power, the unbridled use of power by Daniel Andrews and his government is checked. It hasn't been checked till now, but we've got to check it. We've got to make sure that that power is brought to heel. We need to make sure that all of those who vote for this are held accountable. The community is watching. The community wants to know where you stand on the loss of their jobs, on the homeschooling that's been forced on people, on the impact on the elderly, on the impact of those who live alone, on the impact on the small businesses. All of these are about protection of liberty, proportionality, and making sure that the least impactful public health measures are used. These are not what has been used in this circumstance. They've used the sledgehammer on every turn, and they've done it because it's a lazy, arrogant and disrespectful government. This is a shocking government, the worst public health failure, the worst public policy failure in the state's history, the most damage to Victorians, and it's disgraceful.